This is Johnny Dosco. Stay tuned for another Scoresheet podcast. Holy Kadelka!
Welcome to another Scoresheet podcast. Today I thought I'd try to answer some of the questions that we get every single year. The same questions seem to come up. Thought I'd see if I couldn't answer 3 or 4 of them today. One of them that we get asked fairly regularly is, why don't we have Scoresheet be a daily game instead of a weekly game? Folks kind of like the idea of getting one game's result every day instead of just getting 6 or 7 games once a week. We have, especially years ago, we did put a lot of thought into doing that, especially back when Yahoo was just getting big and they really wanted to have eyeballs coming to their site every single day, and we were in some really short, brief discussions with them about maybe putting our game on their site. So we thought, well, a daily game would be much more what they wanted. The problem is, while it might even lead to more customers for Scoresheet, we just always thought it would lead to also a worse game. The problem with having a simulation in a daily game is you have the problem that not all your players play every day, especially pitchers. If you happen to have 4 of your 5 starting pitchers be on the same kind of rotation clock where they all pitch maybe Monday and then none of them pitch Tuesday, if you play a daily game, you have to use past save stats so that every day you actually have a pitcher available. And once you get into using past stats, you either have to come up with some very complicated rules about when lineups are due or some other very complicated rules so that folks can't simply just bench a player as soon as he has a bad outing and then put him back in their lineup as soon as he has a good outing. So we really think that one of the most fun things about fantasy is compared to the old board games is that you actually have to set your lineups before you see what your players did in real life. And having a daily game just makes that a very difficult thing without a lot of very complicated rules. For instance, you maybe turn in your lineup June 10th, but then some of those stats from after June 10th don't get used till maybe 2 weeks later. So that's why we have a weekly game. That way we just take a week's worth of stats. We figure that if you have a 5-man pitching rotation, they're going to all pitch at least once that week unless they're injured, and then we have a whole week's worth of stats to play games. On a related note, people are asking constantly whether, for instance, if a pitcher starts twice in real life that week, whether when he starts for your Scoresheets team we use the first game of the week or the second game of the week. We don't really do either. Instead, what we do for all players, both pitchers and hitters, is use their weekly totals. So if a pitcher pitches twice in real life but only once for you, his start for you is based on half of his weekly total Major League stats. It's not based just on his first game in the majors or just on his second game. And once again, we do that for the same reason we don't have a daily game. If we used a game-by-game stats, for one, we wouldn't know which stats to use when they pitch twice in real life and only once for you. And if we did it that way and we used one game and told you which one, then you'd kind of know when you were making your next lineup what game was saved and whether you should be putting that pitcher into your lineup based on what stats are already known. So we'll try to explain that again. What we do for all players, pitchers, hitters, everybody, is we just take their weekly total stats from the major leagues. And then each game for you is based on a fraction of those stats. If it's a batter and they had, say, 24 at-bats, then each time he comes up from you, it's 1/24th of his weekly totals. Another question we get fairly often, which is apropos now, is why we have a playoff lineup due September 1st when we don't actually play the playoffs till the end of the year. People say, gee, I'd make a different lineup if I could turn it in October 1st. Well, yes, we understand that, of course, everyone would. You and also your opponents would have a lot more information. You'd know exactly what your players did. But once again, we really like to keep the element of prediction in our game. So while it is true that we use stats from before September 1st also to figure out how a player will do in the playoffs, we feel that by weighting September heavily and making your lineup due September 1st, there's still quite a bit of prediction into your lineup. You don't really know what your players are going to do in September, especially guys like relievers who don't have that many innings. Their September performance can really change how they're going to do in the playoffs for you. Also, if you have some young guy who's about to come up, his September performance, he doesn't really have any stats from before September, so you have to guess whether to put him in the lineup or not before you see how he does in the majors in September. And we feel that that's definitely part of the fun, that would be lost if we let you turn in a playoff lineup at the end of September instead of the beginning. And finally, as the trading deadline approaches, we also always get numerous folks that want to know about the fairness of trades in their continuing league. Continuing meaning keeper league, where you keep players from year to year. You know, trades in single season leagues are pretty easy to evaluate. There's no, well, this is an old guy, that's a young guy, next year the young guy will help me more. It's a single season league. There's no trading of draft picks for next year, no worrying about prospects. And so that's one benefit of a single season leagues is trades are very easy to evaluate. Continuing leagues, it's a much more complicated thing. I mean, you know, Albert Pujols is getting a little older. I can imagine someone who's not going to make the playoffs this year and probably isn't going to make it next year because his team is really a rebuilding project, trading someone like Albert Pujols for Bryce Harper, who might not be in the majors for another couple years. Now, obviously, in a single-season league, it'd be easy to say, no, that's not fair. But in a continuing league, trading a really good older player for some young guys who won't be in the majors for a year or some draft picks can really benefit both teams. The problem, of course, is if you're a team that's not involved in that trade and you're fighting with the team that's getting the star player, it makes it that much harder to beat him out for a playoff spot, which leads to the complaints. But I think folks need to realize in a continuing league that those kind of trades are kind of part of playing in a continuing league. People, especially active owners, once they realize they're not going to make the playoffs in the current season, then some players, anyone they're not planning on keeping the next year isn't really worth anything to them anymore. So they're willing to trade those players for draft picks. And even their older stars, even if they're a good player, you know, they want to get rid of them a year too early, not a year too late. I remember Bill Walsh, when he was coaching the Niners, used to say that all the time. He'd rather trade a player a year before his career starts winding down than hold on to him a year too long, get nothing for him in trade, plus have him play a whole year where he doesn't accomplish much. So I think that, you know, most folks that play Scoresheet like continuing leagues. I'm probably one of the very few folks that prefer one-year leagues, mainly for that trading reason. I don't really want to win or lose a league because I make a lot of trades for middle relievers or not. But I'm in the minority. Probably 90% of the folks playing Scoresheet now play in continuing leagues. So I just want to point out that those kind of trades are part of a continuing league. Those are my thoughts for today. Hope you have a great weekend. And don't forget, go Giants!